There are engines that make you feel something the moment you hear them. There are engines that you even buy an entire car for, and then there are the ones that nobody brags about at all. The engines that never show up on a poster or in forum conversations, but they just keep running year after year without complaint. The Iron Duke was that kind of engine. It was slow, it was rough, and Car and Driver once joked it should be called the Low-Tech 4. But it was one of the most durable engines GM ever made. Tough enough to end up in over 4 million vehicles across 30 different models, from compact Pontiacs to Jeep CJs to the mail trucks running through your neighborhood every single day. Now, to understand why this engine was created, you have to understand what kind of corner the American auto industry had backed itself into by the mid-70s. Pontiac in particular was in serious trouble. They had spent the better part of the prior decade building V8 muscle cars, and they were good at it. But the '73 oil crisis hit the industry hard, and the EPA's tightening emissions rules hit it again before it could recover. Suddenly, the whole industry needed small, efficient, economical engines, and Pontiac did not have one to offer. Chevrolet had already tried to solve this problem with their advanced 2.3-liter aluminum inline-4 for the Vega, and well, the results of that engine were a disaster. Overheating that warped the cylinders, and oil consumption that became catastrophic on many of these motors. The Vega's engine became one of the most notorious reliability failures in the recent American automotive market, and Pontiac, being a GM subsidiary, got to watch the whole thing unfold in real time. Pontiac decided to go in a different direction after seeing this failure, something more low-tech. No aluminum, no overhead cam, no cutting-edge anything. They set out to build something that was stupid simple and that could never put them in the same position that the Vega had put Chevrolet, and that engine would be called the Iron Duke. It was a low-tech 2.5-liter pushrod inline-4 with just 2 valves per cylinder. This classic design, when it debuted in 1977, made only 85 horsepower. Now, there were a lot of misconceptions running around about the Iron Duke's heritage. For example, people like to say it was based on the Pontiac Trophy 4, which was a motor that Pontiac built where they cut a V8 in half and essentially made a 4-banger from the 389. This motor was not related to that, and this was not created by cutting a 305 V8 in half either. This engine was actually closely inspired by an engine based on an adjacent Chevy 2 motor that the Brazilian version of General Motors was making at the time. But engineer John Sawruck retained only a few characteristics of that engine, and while they're similar in design, they share almost no interchangeable parts. According to Sawruck, the Iron Duke was almost entirely original, with bits of influence taken from a lot of different places, including that South American motor, but almost all of the parts were designed from scratch. Where most automakers were trying to save weight by switching cast iron blocks for aluminum or trying to put aluminum heads on these iron block motors, the Iron Duke was a tried and true cast iron motor through and through. It was heavier, sure, but being an inline 4, it was already going to be fairly light no matter what you made it out of. Iron casting techniques at the time were more advanced, more seasoned, and more durable in practice than most aluminum motors. And in the end, the Iron Duke 4 was just under 400 pounds dry, fully built. The Iron Duke was an over-square engine with a big 4-inch bore and a relatively short 3-inch stroke, which helped reduce vibration and ensure that low-end torque was sufficient for street driving, reaching a peak of around 120 foot-pounds under 3,000 RPM. On the downside, the engine was the opposite of rev-happy. Early versions redlined at 5,000 RPM, and they were pretty dead by that point. Its 8.25-to-1 compression ratio was low enough that it could easily run on regular gas without any hint of knock. It also got decent gas mileage, up to 27 to 28 miles per gallon on the highway in a mid-sized car, and sometimes 30 in compacts and subcompacts. For the first year, the Iron Duke launched as a Pontiac exclusive. They needed to distance it from the catastrophic failure that was that 2300 aluminum inline 4 for the Chevy Vega. The Iron Duke team's goal was to show that their engine was a completely different animal, while the Chevy engineers were still struggling to fix the problems with theirs. So for that first year, the Iron Duke found its way into the Pontiac Astra, the Sunbird, the Ventura, and the Phoenix. And those little cars drove the Iron Duke to its early success. Even though it was underpowered, the trade-off for efficiency and reliability was a huge point in its favor. In smaller cars like the compact and subcompact Pontiacs, the lack of power was less noticeable and the fuel efficiency was excellent. And around the mid-70s, that's what a large number of people wanted. After 1977, GM saw the success of the Iron Duke and they expanded its territory to include the Chevy Monza and the Oldsmobile Starfire. And that little inline-4 was the perfect base trim engine. Those who still wanted a V6 or V8 could spend the extra money to get one in certain cars if they wanted to, but there were a ton of people in this era that were just fine with the Iron Duke motor being in their cars. If it got them to work every day and got decent gas mileage, a lot of people didn't care. These first couple years also allowed GM and Pontiac to see how reliable in practice this little Iron Duke 4 was. And as long as you didn't overheat the thing and run it with no coolant, it seemed like it would just keep on going forever. In 1979, they redesigned the engine and they changed and improved most of the components in it. They came up with newer heads with a crossflow design and brought in a new 2-barrel carburetor that they called the Varijet. They moved around a few parts, including the distributor, and they switched to a smaller oil pan. This tinkering brought power up to 90 horsepower instead of 85, and it remained just as durable as the original design. In 1980, we started to hit Iron Duke fever. GM adopted the Iron Duke as its base level engine for all of its X-body cars, including the Citation, the Omega, and the Skylark. It eventually found its way into light trucks like the Chevy S-10 and small SUVs like the GMC Sonoma and GMC Jimmy. Iron Duke proliferation got so crazy in the 80s that they actually started going into cars from a different automaker. The American Motors Corporation bought Iron Dukes for its Spirit and Concorde, as well as the Eagle in 1981. AMC even brought Jeeps into the fray using Iron Dukes in their CJ series. Now, another weird application of the Iron Duke was the Grumman LLV, which you might know better as the old school mail trucks that used to deliver mail across the US. In fact, many of them still are in service, even though they have the newer mail trucks, which are hideous. The government's desired specs for that truck asked for a 24-year-long service life, which is a crazy demand considering that mail trucks are used pretty much all year round and driven a lot every day. They have to deal with constant stop and go, extended idling, and ridiculously high yearly mileage. The Iron Duke 4 was one of the few engines that could reliably deliver this kind of performance. So they used it. In 1982, there was another major advance for the Iron Duke, and that's when they replaced the carburetors with fuel injection on the new motors. It was a relatively primitive throttle body injection system, but again, the theme of this motor was primitive simplicity and not unneeded complexity. Emissions-related changes in 1980 and 1982 have brought the power back down to about 84 horsepower from the 90 mark. The new fuel-injected version of the engine was called the Tech 4, but it was still so basic that Car and Driver magazine joked that it ought to be called the Low Tech 4. Pontiac and GM, though, didn't really care about this little bad press. They only had to look at their bank accounts to know that they were wrong. The Iron Duke was selling like crazy. It was in so many different vehicles, and being low-tech was one of its selling points. It was inexpensive and reliable. They even tried another crazy experiment that year. The Iron Duke was made as the base engine for the 1982 Camaro and Firebird. Yes, if you wanted a car that looked fast but totally wasn't, you could order your Camaro with an Iron Duke 4. Of course, most Camaro buyers went with something larger, like the 5-liter V8, because the Iron Duke Camaro was a snail that took almost 20 seconds to hit 60 miles an hour. Not a quarter-mile time, a 0 to 60 time of about 20 seconds. There was, however, a performance skunkworks project that Pontiac was doing with the Iron Duke. NASCAR needed a pace car for its lower levels, and Pontiac, of course, wanted a piece of that pie in their effort for Iron Duke world domination. They decided to go all out and make the Iron Duke into a racing engine. They replaced practically every part in the engine with forged components, they tried a bunch of different stroke lengths, and they created Super Duty Iron Dukes with displacements ranging from 2.1 liters, a bit down from the 2.5 liter displacement, all the way up to 3.2 liters. And surprisingly enough, all that tinkering didn't really seem to reduce the Iron Duke's durability, and they were able to get like 230 horsepower out of some of these naturally aspirated. Sadly, those Super Duty Iron Dukes never made it into any factory car, but you could buy crate engines and parts to convert an Iron Duke to a Super Duty, but the volume of these upgrades was pretty low because, after all, the effort to go into doing that, most people would just swap a V8 in or just buy a car with a V8 if they wanted to go fast. The Performance Iron Duke didn't really fulfill its initial purpose at being compact and affordable, so what was the point? The Performance Iron Duke wasn't really an affordable solution for economy, and that's what people had come to know it for. Performance was not its thing. Even though the special racy motors were largely kept away from the public, GM kept working on incremental improvements for the Iron Duke, and people just kept lining up to buy them. The new swirl port heads they introduced with 9-to-1 compression added another 2 horsepower in 1984, just in time to be put into the new Pontiac Fiero. The little mid-engine wedge-shaped car looked sporty, but with an Iron Duke behind it, it wasn't anything special performance-wise. 1985 brought in new lifters and an improved crankshaft for the Iron Duke. 1987 brought another wave of changes, including a new ignition system that didn't use a traditional distributor, which was handy because it was a huge pain in the butt to get to the distributor and rotor on some of the Iron Dukes in different cars. Up to that point, the Iron Duke had relied on its short stroke and long connecting rods to keep vibrations down and keep the RPMs down, and they were partially successful. One of the few criticisms for the Iron Duke, besides its gutless power output, was that it sounded like trash. And of course, bad sounds mean that extra vibrations might be happening somewhere else. So, in 1988, GM finally added a balance shaft to the little engine to quiet it down even more. They kept on building the Iron Duke up until 1993, when its peak version made 110 horsepower and peaked at 5,500 RPM. It still wasn't fast, but over time, millions of people bought cars with the Iron Duke engines and enjoyed it for the engine that it was, a purely utilitarian commuter tool. There was plenty of aftermarket support available for a long time after GM was done with the Iron Duke in '93 though. These engines actually became extremely popular for boat racing of all things, and a company called Kansas Racing Products went so far as to buy the rights to manufacture these engines for racing purposes. And Cosworth was working on a special version with 4 valves per cylinder. For its near 20 years of faithful service, the Iron Duke was an extremely reliable engine. It helped GM regain some credibility when it came to reliability, and it helped millions of people get to and from work every day, and it's probably the reason that all of your packages got delivered mostly on time over the last 30 to 40 years. It's an engine that doesn't get much hype, and most people just kind of talk down on it because the Iron Duke Camaros are so slow, which is valid, don't buy one of those, but as a purely utilitarian engine for the time, the Iron Duke was world class. Now let me know in the comments down below if you ever owned a GM vehicle back in period that had an Iron Duke 4 in it. Let me know the reliability of it and just overall how you like the engine. I would love to hear it in the comments down below. Otherwise, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Otherwise, I will see you all in the next one, enthusiasts.